For this episode of Scholar Talks, the guiding question is, how did Sherman's March to the Sea support emancipation during the Civil War? Bennett Parten is our guest, and he's a professor of history at Georgia Southern University who specializes in the Civil War era. He is the author of Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation, which we will discuss today. I'm Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Scholar Talks in our America 250 series. Ben, I want to thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Very good. You know, I love the book. Congratulations on your new book. And, you know, I just love it because, you know, we know the familiar story of Sherman's March to the Sea, right? It's sort of this institution of hard war, of total war, of trying to demoralize and sort of crush the South as he goes up towards Grant in Virginia, you know, to link up the armies and so forth. You know, we're heading towards the end of the war. And yet you also so deftly weave it together with a lesser known part of the story, which is the emancipation of enslaved persons, military emancipation, self-emancipation, and you just so nicely tell that story in a very, very well-written book about those two complete aspects. So it really helps round out the story. So really enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's very nice of you.
Great. So can you provide for our viewers maybe a little bit of historical background with both Sherman's March to the Sea and emancipation policy during the war? I know this is a big topics, right? But if you could give us a little introduction to it.
Yeah, sure. No, happy to. So Sherman's March to the Sea, otherwise known as the Savannah campaign, it begins in mid-November of 1864. This is the last full year of the Civil War. In the East, Grant has Lee pinned down at Petersburg. The next movement there will be towards Appomattox the following year. And then Georgia, Sherman has just taken Atlanta, which is a really important strategic victory for a variety of different reasons. But the March to the Sea is Sherman's next move. It's a roughly 250-mile march. It takes about a month and a half from Atlanta to Savannah and will include about 60,000 soldiers. But this wasn't necessarily your ordinary campaign. I mean, one of the things that Sherman is very clear about is that in leaving Atlanta, he has to leave his supply lines behind. And so he instructs his men to forage off the plantations and fields of middle and central Georgia, both as a means of sustaining his army, but also as a means of targeting the emotional and material wherewithal of white Southerners to keep up the fight. This is something that Sherman's very clear about. And so in that sense, this campaign is going to be one of the most intimate, up close, and somewhat personal of the entire war. And this is one reason why it becomes such an emancipation event. That and the fact that by 1864, the war has fully evolved into a war that will end slavery. This is an evolution that begins early in 1861 with a series of congressional acts. It also begins in part because wherever the army goes in the Civil War, even at its earliest stages, enslaved people are always there running to the army, which pushes Congress to act. It's an evolution that's going to reach a crescendo of sorts with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which he announces in the fall of 1862, and then authorizes, or issues, I should say, on January 1st, 1863, and then comes to a real climax here in Georgia with Sherman's March. And so by now, the war is clearly a war that will end slavery. This is one of the reasons that it becomes the emancipation event that it does.
Okay, great. And so thinking about more of the Army side, how does military emancipation fit Sherman's goals of hard war, and how does it just so thoroughly disrupt the Confederate war effort, but then also the society and the economy, which is rooted upon slavery?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question because it kind of doesn't fit into Sherman's view of hard war. I mean, it really doesn't. And maybe the best way to imagine this or think about this is to think about his time serving as the military governor of Memphis in 1862. He is there in 1862 just as Congress is beginning to work on the Second Confiscation Act, which is Congress's precursor to the Emancipation Proclamation. And all the while that he's there, he's dealing with the problem of Confederate guerrillas. His men are being fired upon by Confederate partisans, plying up and down the river. Civilian ships are being fired upon. And Sherman's answer is to begin developing this hard war strategy. One of the things that he does is he begins sending soldiers out to the villages and towns that harbor these guerrillas. He'll burn them, sometimes leave one single building just so they can mark the spot on a map. And then he'll begin to expelling local families. I think it's 10 local families for every shot fired on one of his men. And so we really can see the origins of his hard war strategy there in Memphis. He'll do something similar in terms of its, well, certainly the destruction, but also the expulsion of families in Atlanta. But it's in this moment, too, that he's beginning to think really critically about emancipation. And the fact is, he doesn't see it as being central to the war effort at all. He wants to keep both the military strategy and emancipation completely separate, in part because he doesn't see, or he sees freedom as being nothing but an extraction. And he sees emancipation as something that can slow down his army and be a detriment to his army rather than something that could actually advance the war effort. Now, by 1864, he's evolved slightly, but I want to stress slightly. He now sees slavery as something that can be targeted to advance the war effort, and he sees it to some degree as part of his hard war strategy, but he's still very reticent to embrace it fully. And that, in some ways, represents, or at least embodies, how Sherman thinks about emancipation along his march. He's happy to free enslaved people. He is not all that happy to have them follow his army, but his main priority is completing the campaign no matter what.
Great. I think we're going to get back to some of that ambivalence,
Sure.
in a few questions. So, but looking at African Americans, what decisions shaped, as you described, thousands, maybe as many as 20,000 of enslaved people's decision to self-emancipate, to flee to Union lines? And what was their experience with the Army during the march? They're talking about more ambivalence there in the book.
Yeah, no, sure. And you're absolutely right. When Sherman gets to Savannah, he speculates that there's maybe as many as 20,000 freed refugees following, which is a huge number. That's roughly equivalent to the size of Savannah itself. But that 20,000 number doesn't take into account the people who might have run to the Army and then were turned back by the Army, or voluntarily decide to turn back on their own volition. It doesn't take into account the people who might have run to the Army, spoke with the Army, spoke with Sherman, his soldiers, and then decided not to make the journey itself. And it certainly doesn't take into account the people who experience freedom just as a consequence of this movement. And so when we take all these factors combined, I think what we have here is the largest emancipation event in American history. But we also have to recognize, right, that there is a range of different calculations that have to be made by enslaved people. And there are a range of experiences that enslaved people experience, right, in this moment. And in terms of the calculations, they've got to think about, well, one, their family. Are they going to be able to make this journey if they do decide to follow the Army as a family unit? They've got to think about what might lie ahead, right? Where is the Army going? What is life going to be like when we get there? Is the freedom that I'm pursuing something that's going to be tangible and real, or completely undefined? And then two, they've got to think, can they physically make this march, right? There's no guarantee that it's going to end in Savannah. It's not even clear that Savannah is the target. And this is a real movement, right? I mean, it lasts about a month and a half. And so there's real questions about whether or not enslaved people can physically endure the hardship that's going to come with making this march. But many do make this calculation. And the experience with the Army is itself also a real range, right? There's a range of experiences. Some are turned back or forced back. Some are welcomed into the Army. Some are pushed to the back where they follow the Army. Some join the Army as cooks, laundresses, valets, military laborers. But if there's one through line, I think, that defines this experience, it's that at every step of the march, enslaved people consistently acted as the soldiers' allies. Despite the fact that many soldiers did not welcome them, despite the fact that many soldiers carried the same prejudices, right, that we would imagine a 19th century American maybe having, the soldiers always allied, or excuse me, the enslaved people always allied with the soldiers. They did everything from serving as intelligence agents to scouts to lookouts. And maybe the best story is that in advance of Sherman's army, many of the white families actually buried or hid their goods or their livestock. But of course, they didn't do the actual hiding of these goods themselves. They forced enslaved people to do it. And so this armed enslaved people with knowledge for where the family corral of horses had been hidden, where in the cemetery the trunk of valuables had been buried. And so enslaved people were very willing to pilot the soldiers to these caches of goods or corrals and use it as a real bargaining chip to appeal for inclusion within the march. And then just one other quick story, another example of just how central enslaved people were to the Army and to the Army's success comes just north of Savannah. This is a part of Georgia that's sort of the rice swamps of the Savannah River. Here, the plantations are not nearly as abundant. And here, too, the march slows to a crawl. There are a few days where the foraging parties questioned whether or not they were going to return empty handed. And there were real questions as to whether or not the Army was actually going to be able to complete this campaign. And many of the soldiers on Sherman's left wing might have gone hungry, but in fact, enslaved people there sustained them by teaching them how to hull rice and how to prepare rice. Sherman's army of Midwesterners, folks from Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and elsewhere. If they've eaten rice, they certainly didn't know how to actually produce it. But nonetheless, in these really important days on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia's enslaved people sustained them and sustained the march by teaching them how to eat and prepare rice.
Right, and just a quick follow up, which kind of leads me into my next question as well. But as you point out, like it really strained sort of Union supplies and the food that they were living off the land and so forth, and they're exposed to the elements and so forth. So it's just a really difficult experience for them as well.
It is, absolutely. And of course, the greatest danger is the fact that while there isn't a whole lot of resistance in the form of Confederate infantry, in fact, there's none at all, really. There is Confederate cavalry that's always hovering around, that's always trying to do the best they can to snipe at the army, and as a consequence, are always there hovering around the refugees, and who, if given the chance, would capture, sometimes kill the refugees as this march is happening.
Right, and capture probably meant either execution or being returned to enslavement. Right.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So, what is their experience then of the freed people once they arrive in Savannah and this experiment of Port Royal, in the surrounding islands and coastal areas, is not always a pleasant one, is it?
No, not at all. And maybe let me start by saying a little bit about Port Royal, or the Port Royal experiment, which um, I think undoubtedly is one of the most important stories of the Civil War. And for listeners who might not be familiar, this is arguably where freedom happens first in the Civil War. Port Royal is just north of Savannah, south of Charleston. It's in the Sea Islands of South Carolina. It's truly the low country of South Carolina. And Port Royal matters because it is the deepest deep water port on the southern coastline. And so early in the war, in the fall of 1861, U.S. naval ships sail into Port Royal Sound because they want to take it over and use it as a base of operations to blockade both Charleston and Savannah. And when they do, it forces the local Confederates, the local white plantation owners, into taking flight. And they leave behind about 10,000 enslaved people who, for all intents and purposes, are free in a de facto sense. But this is in the fall of 1861, long before the U.S. government's going to begin making this evolution in terms of emancipation. And so there's a real question of, well, what does the government do with these people? How are they legally defined? What's their status? But fortunately, Salmon Chase, who is Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, he develops a plan along with a man named Edward Pierce to send down teams of Northern philanthropists, humanitarians, teachers, technocrats, and other agents to begin administering aid, to begin building schools, holding religious services. But critically, and this is the critical but, they also want to coerce or coax or convince enslaved people to go back into the fields working not as enslaved laborers, but as free laborers. And so this entire project, known as the Port Royal experiment, is really meant to be the tip of the spear that will begin putting more pressure on the government to evolve, right, and to embrace emancipation and be a project that can really begin to hasten this evolution along and speed up the transition and ease the transition from slavery to freedom, from slave labor to free labor. And the entire history of the Port Royal experiment is one that is very complicated, but it matters for this story because when Sherman arrives on the coast of Georgia, he makes the decision to begin sending the 20,000 refugees that are following him down the Ogeechee River, which is a really important artery down in my part of the world here in Savannah, just south of the city and south of the Savannah River. He sends them down the Ogeechee, out to the Atlantic, and up to Port Royal on the assumption that this would be a place that is best suited to care for them as any. But he turns out to be wrong, in part because while there is a certain level of infrastructure there, the arrival of so many refugees is going to turn Port Royal into the epicenter of a sprawling refugee crisis that will expand up and down the coastline of South Carolina and Georgia. There's eventually going to be a lack of food, a lack of shelter, and pretty soon disease is going to begin running rampant as well. And so the outcome of what happens when the refugees arrive in Port Royal turns tragic.
Right, and the problem that, in a sense, doesn't go away, right? Because when Sherman starts marching and moves on Columbia and keeps going up into North Carolina, the problem comes up again because there's just more and more enslaved, thousands and thousands of more enslaved persons coming to the
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the ideas that Sherman had and the U.S. Army and the War Department had was that in placing them at Port Royal, uh, that Port Royal could be a kind of base of operations, could be a colony. That's the term that many of them use for freed people who flee to the army, so that the army can continue making its march as unencumbered as possible. And so this is meant to be a real colony. Sometimes you see it referred to as the Sherman Reserve, because one of the things that Sherman's also going to do is in that winter of 1864, 1865, and in fact, it's January 16th, is that he's going to issue his Special Field Orders number 15, which begins setting aside requisition plantation space for exclusively African American homesteading. This is also going to take place right in the same area that the Port Royal experiment is taking place as well. And pretty soon, land reform is going to fall under the ambit or the brief, I suppose you could say, of the Port Royal experiment as well.
right, which is a great segue to our my next question, final question, which includes Reconstruction. So, going back to the guiding question, how does Sherman's March to the Sea support emancipation during the war? And how does it reveal the complexities of emancipation and Reconstruction, as you just pointed out?
Yeah, sure. Well, unquestionably, I think Sherman's March is the campaign that conquers the Confederacy and I think fully destroys slavery. I mean, it's easy in hindsight to look at November of 1864 and assume, well, the war is going to end and emancipation is going to be an outcome, right, of the end of the war. But the fact is that things were still very uncertain as of November 1864. I mean, Lincoln wins re-election maybe a week, right, just before Sherman launches in his March to the Sea. So this is all happening right alongside each other. So there's no guarantee that the war is going to end the way that it does, and there's no guarantee that emancipation is going to be an outcome of it. And so I think the experience of the march is one that seals and secures emancipation and later abolition as one of the great consequences of the Civil War. And two, I think we can see the march really as this culminating moment of federal emancipation policy and the Army's movements all coming together. As I said, this is happening at a time that is after the Emancipation Proclamation. It's happening towards the end of the war. Uh, in a way, I think enslaved people really understand, right, that the army is an army of liberation, and that if they can flee to the army, they will find some form of freedom. But I want to stress some form of freedom because I think this answers your final question. The reality, right, is that freedom was always itself undefined, and part of the effort of enslaved people was to try to give it some form of definition in this uh, harried historical moment. And two, that search is something that never really gets defined, even as the war ends and the calendar turns into, the spring, summer, fall of 1865. And I think that is a reality of the story I'm trying to tell, which is that it has a very ambiguous and unfulfilled ending. But I
Mhm.
think that too is a metaphor, or at least a storyline of the Civil War and of Reconstruction more broadly, which is that the way we understand our Civil War and the way we understand Reconstruction is one of real ambiguity and of a promise that goes unfulfilled.
Well, maybe that's the topic of your next book. I don't know. So, uh, Ben, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for joining us, and congratulations on your book. It's really magnificent. So we encourage everyone to go out and read it.
Yeah. Tony, thanks for having me. It's been a blast.
Thanks. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out our other interviews in the America 250 series on our channel.